Why would anyone choose to use a hive design that's not as commercially available, doesn't have as many experienced beekeepers to mentor new beekeepers, and is not compatible with the current standard hives? That's the question I want to talk about today. If you have seen beehives anywhere in the US, chances are what you've seen are Langstroth hives. The familiar boxes, a small rectangular box stacked on another, stacked on another, stacked on another. Langstroth hives are the de facto standard in the US and are used by the vast majority of keepers. In fact, I have 3 Langstroth hives right here behind me. But I have a strong preference for the horizontal Layens hive, like that one right over there. Before I get into discussing my preferences, I want to get into a very abbreviated and somewhat incomplete history of beehives to give a background of the Langstroth and the Layens hives. Both the Langstroth and the Layens hives use removable frames. But before that, the more common hives were pretty much any cavity that could be used to house bees. One of the more popular, which some people still use today, are skeps, which you've probably seen at least pictures of them. They look like an upside down basket and the bees live inside. Another traditional type of hive was the gum, which is basically a hollow log used to house the bees. I don't know why it's called a gum, but I think it has to do with the log. In some parts of the country, animal traps that were made from hollow logs are also called gums. Both of those types of hives do not have removable frames, and so harvesting honey from them required at least an extreme disturbance for the bees to tear apart their comb. At worst, it meant killing off the colony in order to get the honey. In the early days, that was seen as a small sacrifice because it was assumed that another colony would eventually move into that hive. Reverend Lorenzo Langstroth, who lived from 1810 to 1895, patented his hive in 1852. Langstroth, who in addition to being a beekeeper was a preacher and a teacher, gave us a lot of the conventions that we still use in beekeeping today. He didn't discover bee space, but he leveraged it in his hive design, and he popularized and standardized the removable frame hive, which allowed beekeepers to inspect their colonies and harvest honey with less disturbance to the bees. In his writings, Langstroth argues in multiple ways for man's mastery and dominion over the bees. One of his quotes is that the Creator intended the bee as surely as the horse or the cow for the comfort of man. Now, Langstroth's original design apparently used thicker walls, about 2-inch thick, which is closer to the environment that bees would seek out for a natural hive. But current versions of the Langstroth hive use 3/4-inch lumber, and they're size to be easily transportable for commercial beekeepers. 4 hives can fit easily on a pallet. And so Langstroth's hive design, being particularly beneficial for migratory commercial beekeepers, has become very popular and is widely adopted by backyard hobbyist beekeepers as well. George de Layens, who lived from 1834 to 1897, was a French botanist and apiculturalist. His work followed shortly after Langstroth's, but his philosophy was quite a bit different. Rather than talking about the mastery of man over the bee, Layens' approach was more bee-centric and focused on using local bees in hives that were well suited to their nature. One of my favorite quotes from George de Layens is, "We cannot improve beekeeping by going farther and farther away from bees' natural tendencies. Instead, pick the hive model that's best matched to your locale, populate it with local bees, and the results will speak for themselves." Although de Layens' approach had a lot to do with working with the nature of the bees, I think there's a lot about the hives that's beneficial for the beekeeper too. For example, in a typical Layens hive, you only have 1 box to deal with. You're not dealing with supers to stack on top or stacks of equipment that you have to store. When you're working with the Layens hive, you're dealing with individual frames at a time. You're not having to lift boxes of frames to get in and inspect the hive. As you work the hive, you also have a consistent working height. You can set the hive on a stand so it's always at a good, comfortable level. And one other area where I think the Layens hive makes things really easy on the beekeeper is for overwintering. And this is really what sealed the deal for me. Before I started keeping bees, I went to Dr. Leo Shurashkin's seminar in the fall. when he was preparing his hives for winter. At the time, I was uncertain about the hive type I was going to use, and I was actually not leaning towards Layens, although I was looking at other horizontal styles. But as I was researching beekeeping at that time in the fall, I saw conversations online in which new beekeepers were discussing and asking questions about how much honey to leave in the hive and how to prepare their hives for winter and so on, and it all seemed so complicated. And then I went and watched Dr. Leo prepare his hive for winter. And getting that hive ready for winter was so easy, in large part because it was really the bees who did the preparation. The keeper just leverages the bee's nature. When honeybees move into a cavity and start building comb, they start building one piece of comb hanging down from the top of the cavity. And as that piece of comb grows, they'll add another on next to it, and then another on next to it. And as they add comb next to each other, that array of comb, or a horizontal array of comb that they're building vertically, as soon as they have cells that are deep enough to raise brood, the queen will begin laying in those cells. And as that comb grows down, that brood area will also grow with the comb. But as that comb becomes longer, that brood area will eventually migrate downward, and the bees will begin backfilling the top of that comb with honey. Now, the exact size, shape, and number of combs will vary depending on the cavity in which the bees are building their hive. But in any case, that comb is going to be a continuous sheet from top to bottom. And throughout the spring into the summer, the bees will continue building out that comb and raising brood and producing more bees, and the hive will grow. As winter is approaching, that comb that the bees have already backfilled at the top with honey is ready for the bees to form their cluster where the brood once was, to survive on that honey that's at the top. Now, they don't just store honey at the top of the comb. As that colony grows out horizontally, the brood will usually remain close to the entrance, and the bees will store excess honey on the comb farther out. So then over the winter, they have the honey at the top of the comb for the cluster to eat, and they have honey on the outer fringes that will be accessible to them as they go into spring. And then the colony will move up, the queen will start laying again, and the whole process will start over. The Layens hive gives a good environment, in my opinion, where the bees can produce comb in the same way they would if left to their own nature. In other words, they build continuous comb top to bottom. And although a hive is built for a certain number of frames, for example, this hive is built to hold a maximum of 20 frames, the space is adjustable to provide only the number of frames that the bees need as they're building out. So we can take a divider board if we have a small colony. Now we have a hive of 3 frames. And as that colony expands and needs more space, just as they would build comb in a natural enclosure, we can add more frames for the growth of that colony. In other words, like a natural hive, we have a horizontal array of vertical comb. The Layens hives that I prefer to use have insulated thick walls. There is plywood on the outside and the inside with 1.5 inches of insulation in between. This thicker, more insulated space better approximates the thick walls of a hollow tree that the honeybees tend to prefer in nature. Tom Seeley has documented that honeybees prefer a well-insulated space that's not drafty and just has a simple small entrance at the bottom. And that's how I build my hives. Besides the insulated walls and insulated floor, which it's debatable whether the floor really needs insulation, I also insulate all of my lids. So 1.5 inches of insulation on the sides and 3 inches on the top. The only ventilation on the hive is on the entrance, and I only use 1 entrance at a time per colony. I also believe that the design of the Layens hive provides less disturbance for the bees during inspections. The solid top bars of the frames provides a continuous ceiling, or a hive within a hive. In other words, when I lift the lid off of the hive, I'm not immediately exposing the bees, except for those that might be in this empty area. Instead, as I go through inspections, I'm only exposing a frame or a couple frames at a time as I work through the colony. And to be honest, When inspecting the hives during the spring flow, a lot of times all I'm looking at are these in frames to see if I need to add more space for the bees to expand. I find that comparing inspections of my Layens hives to my Langstroth hives, the bees in the Layens hives tend to be much more calm and less defensive while I'm inspecting the hive. Langstroth beekeepers are probably familiar with the sight when you take the lid off of your Langstroth hive and those frames don't touch, so the bees can come up in between, and you see rows of guard bees popping up at the top watching your every move. In the Layens hive, the bees that are working over here in the brood area are virtually undisturbed and may have little idea that anything's going on. Now I want to do a comparison of how that comb building and hive building happens within a Langstroth hive. And those of you who've been keeping Langstroth forever, this is nothing new to you, and you might be getting ready to write me an angry comment that I'm criticizing the Langstroth hive. But if I'm going to share what I prefer about the Layens, I have to be candid about the downsides I see in Langstroth. So let's start out. We've got a bottom board here, and we're going to build our hive on that. So we'll start with a deep brood box, and we'll put the bees in here and let them fill out this box. The box is filled with frames that are about 9 inches deep. So we have basically a horizontal frame that's not all that deep. So it won't take long, if it's a strong colony, for them to build up this box with brood and some honey, but there's not a lot of space for that. So then if it's a really strong colony, we might add another deep onto this, or if it's an average colony or we're doing single brood box management, we might want to put a honey super on that. But before we do that, we're going to put on our queen excluder to control where the bees do and do not put brood. And then we'll put our honey supers on top. So we'll start with one and we'll keep on going. If we have a good honey flow, they fill up this, but get this box nearly full, then we'll put another one on top and so on. And each time we do this, we're expanding the space by the volume of this box all at once. If we went to 2 brood boxes, we'd be doubling the colony space all at once rather than expanding it gradually as the colony grows. So we get our boxes stacked up here. Of course, we're going to have our lid on top, and we have our hive. So as our hive was constructed, rather than the bees building comb from the top down as they would naturally, we forced them to build and populate comb from the bottom up. The end result is effectively the same, but we as beekeepers put the management of that on ourselves rather than letting the bees manage it. At the same time, rather than having that continuous comb from top to bottom as they would build naturally, we now have segmented comb. Each of these boxes has 10 frames in it, and between those frames there's a gap. So instead of having our horizontal array of vertical comb, we have a vertical array of horizontal comb. Throughout that process, we've taken control over where the bees can and can't put brood, rather than letting them naturally put brood close to the entrance and then expanding out into the honey frames. One other issue with the typical Langstroth boxes is that as we have these boxes stacked, since there's not a perfect seal, and you can see my boxes are kind of chipped out at the corners here, rather than having a snug insulated enclosure, we've got a thin-walled box with gaps and places for drafts to come in. And so the bees are going to be required to seal that up with propolis. Overall, we're putting more work on ourselves and on the bees. And now when I inspect this hive, if I want to inspect the brood, see how things are going down there, I've got to deconstruct this hive completely to get there. Does that mean the Langstroth hive doesn't work? Obviously that would be a false statement, because people have been keeping successfully in the Langstroth hive for almost 200 years now. But I just want you to understand some of the comparative differences. I do want to address some of the concerns and downsides that I've heard about the Layens hives. One of the primary ones is about portability. The Layens hives aren't as well designed to be moved around or used for commercial purposes as the Langstroth. And yeah, the Langstroth hives are particularly designed to fit 4 to a pallet, as I mentioned. But I've started standardizing my hives using the 20 frame insulated hive design that you just saw, and I've moved several of these to remote locations, and it really hasn't been a problem. I have started adding handles to the ends of my hives to make them easier for a couple people to pick up and move, but if someone wanted to use these for commercial purposes, moving them around, I don't see any reason why you couldn't stack Layens hives on a pallet. I'm not saying they're as well suited for commercial purposes, but it is a possibility. One thing about the Layens hives is you can make a hive as long as you want to hold as many frames as you want. So if you end up with a behemoth like my Taj Hive right here that holds 30 frames and is built in an oversized box, this thing isn't going to be moved around easily. But the portability of the hives themselves is going to depend on the overall size that you're using. One benefit for portability is that with the Layens hive you have a single box. You don't have to worry about pulling off supers in order to then move the brood boxes. Instead, you can just pull out any excess frames to reduce weight, secure the frames that are in the hive in place, and when I move hives, that's what I do. I'll put a bar up against my divider board and just a couple screws to hold it down, and then take the hive where you need it to go. A lot of people also have concerns about extraction. The Layens frames do not fit in extractors that are built for the Langstroth frames. I use an SAF Regatta extractor, which when I got it, that was about the only one on the market. But a couple others have been added since then. Hilco now has a Minimax model for the Layens frames. The Lyson large frame extractor can also be used for Layens frames. Some people will say that these extractors are more expensive. But the fact is, if you look at what the extractors are, the size of the extractors is equivalent to a 9-frame radial extractor for Langstroth shallow frames. In fact, the SAF Regatta extractor that I use uses the same tub as the SAF Natura, which is a 9-frame Langstroth extractor. And you can actually exchange the baskets and use the extractor either way. But even if you only have a Layens extractor, you can use those Layens baskets to extract Langstroth frames of any size. So when you look at the Layens extractors and the prices for them, you need to compare apples to apples and understand that what you're looking at is basically the equivalent of a 9-frame Langstroth extractor. And when you do that, you'll see that the prices are very comparable. Equipment availability is also a big concern. Now, I'm fairly handy with woodworking tools. I'm not going to by any means claim to be an expert woodworker, but even with that, I've still been able to build the majority of my own hives. I also have a video on how to reuse old Langstroth boxes and make them into a Layens hive. But it's true that you're not going to go to a typical beekeeping store in the US and find a lot of Layens equipment. It's also true that a Layens hive is going to cost more than a Langstroth hive up front, but considering that a Langstroth hive is just a pine box, whereas the Layens hives like I use are layers of wood with insulation, there's a lot more to the hive, except you don't have all the extra boxes and equipment that you have to store in the off-season. As the hives grow in popularity, the availability of equipment will grow as well. Another concern is the incompatibility of Layens hives to Langstroth equipment. And that is a problem for a lot of people. If you're buying bees in a Langstroth nucleus colony and trying to move those bees into a Layens hive, you've got to do some sort of conversion. And there are methods out there that will take the Langstroth frames and turn them on end and use an adapter frame to put them into the Layens hive. I'm not crazy about those because the bees build their comb with an orientation. The cells will be angled down towards the center of the comb. And so when you turn that 90 degrees, now they're not angled down anymore, they are sideways. You can also cut the frames, which I've advised a few people to do. So you can take your Langstroth frame, cut out the middle section where you have most of your brood and resources, and screw that inside of a Layens frame. And that way you retain the comb in its orientation and don't have to use a special spacer frame, but that's just another approach. My approach is that I built a conversion hive, this wooden hive you see right here. Well, all my hives are wooden, but the one that's unpainted, which will hold both Langstroth and Layens frames side by side using adapters for the Layens portion. And I did a whole video series on that hive and a video on how I built it. I actually have a colony in there now. It's a swarm I caught, put them in a Langstroth box, and then and moving them onto Layens frames. It's worked really well for me. For the most part, concerns that I've heard people having about the Layens hives really haven't been a big problem for me. When it comes down to it, the choice of a hive design, as much or more than just being a matter of the form factor, is about a philosophy of beekeeping. Having kept bees in both Langstroth and Layens hives, I find that my Langstroth hives require a whole lot more work on my part to manage the hive, whereas the Layens hives require me to let go and let the bees manage their hive. I've heard from several people who have converted from Langstroth to Layens and said that at first they just hated it because they tried to manage their Layens hives in the same way they managed their Langstroth, meaning they tried to take control over every aspect of the hive. And while the Layens hive is not entirely hands-off, you still have to inspect the hive, check on your bees, make sure things are going well, add frames as needed, prepare them for winter. There's also a certain aspect of the Layens hive that requires that we as beekeepers let go of the management of the hives and instead turn that over to the nature of the bees. I hope that this video has been helpful for you in understanding the reasoning of why people like me prefer to use the Layens hives. If you've watched the video this far, you might as well go ahead and give it a like before it wraps up. And if you're just getting started and want to know a great place to get bees, check out this video about how to catch swarms for yourself. If you've already watched that one, here's another one that YouTube thinks you'll really like. Thanks a lot for watching. I'll see you next time.